Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Nathan Stoltzfus, and he is a professor of Holocaust Studies in the Arts and Sciences and professor of history at Florida State University. And he published a book in August 2021. Title of the book is, or he's the editor of this book. Title is The Power of Populism and People, Resistance and Protest in the Modern World. And he is also the author of Hitler's Compromises, published 2016, and Resistance of the Heart, Intermarriage and the Rosenstrasse Protest in Nazi Germany, published 1996, and was a co-recipient of the Institute of Contemporary History's Frankel Prize and acknowledged as a New Statesman Book of the Year. He is also the co-editor with Robert Galately of Social Outsiders in Nazi Germany, 2001, and with Henry Friedlander of Nazi Crimes and the Law, 2008. But again, the title of this book just published is The Power of Populism and People, Resistance and Protest in the Modern World. And it's Professor Nathan Stoltzfus. So Nathan Stoltzfus, are you there?
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. Excellent. It's kind of a broadcast, but it is a podcast. Most of my stuff goes on audio. For people who may not have heard of your background, can you talk kind of about what you've written about and what led you to compile this book, The Power of Populism and People?
Okay, so in graduate school, I met a professor who was very interested. I studied with a range of professors. One was Joseph Nye, who has used the term soft power to refer to power that doesn't come out of the barrel of a gun. I also studied with Gene Sharp, who was a kind of guru of what he called nonviolent sanctions. That is, things that didn't destroy property or people and yet still had a way of exerting power. Now, collectivity is a key part, a collective action of certainly the nonviolent sanctions. The theory is that any leader needs to some extent the cooperation and consent of the people who that leader claims to rule. Of course, Joseph Nye's idea of soft power includes ideas about diplomacy, etc. But collective action is the notion that's especially relevant since the French Revolution, notions that people have to have a say in their government. And I got involved with this idea about the book that you mentioned that W.W. Norton published in '96 called The Rosenstrasse Protest and Intermarriage. Of the married to a non-Jew. And how did it happen that they survived? Certainly it was impossible that the Nazis were fond of them because in Nazi Germany, the Nazis did not look kindly on that at all, defiling the race. And of course, they were no way to promote the Nazi idea that Jews were so inferior and so different that they weren't really human and that they didn't belong in Germany and had to be shoved out. So it certainly wasn't, they were actually particularly loathsome Jews, not particularly welcomed. So the question was, why did they survive? And it's a particular set of circumstances having to do with Hitler's peculiar sensitivity to his image and the fact that his image in Nazi Germany was the glue that held the consensus, that held people behind him, the image of him. And because of this image, Hitler refused to get into specifics of controversies, tried to remain above it all. If there was controversy, that those different points of controversy could be directed or blamed on his subordinates, not Hitler himself. And it led to, of course, I'm talking about the rule within the Reich, Hitler's own race. Outside of the Reich, there was no limits on the use of force and violence and brutality. But the occupation of other countries during war, the genocide of the Jews, the horror within that the regime used within the Third Reich. So there are a set of circumstances there. The regime certainly never intended that these intermarried Jews in Germany would actually escape murder and genocide, but a set of circumstances kept evolving so that the regime depended on the deportation of the intermarried Jews.
Nathan, can you hear me?
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you came back. My suggestion is let's stop the camera and see,
Okay.
just go on pure audio. So if you can stop the cam, it might help with the latency.
Well, actually, what happened was that my router changed, and so yeah, sure, I'm fine with this.
Okay, you think it's going to come back? Okay, because I lost you for about 30 seconds. So you were talking, I think where you left off was, how did the Jews survive who intermarried? And Hitler was very more sensitive for policies within Germany than in conquered territories or other countries, right?
Exactly. Hitler wanted to transform society in Germany so that the people themselves embraced National Socialism, so that they became Nazis and acted like Nazis, even if nobody was looking at them, and that they were from the inside out. And he had this principle that the mass movement that he started should never lose momentum. He wanted that to keep spreading, whether deepening or widening, that people would be actually continually becoming more convinced. In other words, he realized that he couldn't do anything without the people, and that he wanted them to have unquestioning consent. And how he tried to get that, most of all, was to show the Germans that what he was doing was giving them what they wanted better than any other leader or system, that Nazism was really the key for them to get what they wanted.
Right, and I think you wrote in your intro that he actually shut down other public gatherings to ensure that only the Nazis would and the populist or the popular polity would get National Socialist ideas instead of communist or
exactly. And actually, the communists were prohibited from any public protest within a day or two of when he was named chancellor. Within short weeks of when he became chancellor, there was a prohibition on any public gatherings that were not organized by the Nazi Party. In other words, he is pioneering this new prohibition that autocrats and ban and punishment of popular protests and public protests that autocrats today are just as concerned with as repression of the media. They see popular protest not only as a way of expressing opinion, but as a visual. These autocrats, including Hitler, are very sensitive to image and to optics, and they want to control that, to manage that, so that it looks like they have a consensus and that there isn't dissent. And it's just as important for them to ban and prohibit popular gatherings and protests as it is for them to ban the free press.
Right. And so you can see kind of those same, Hitler's probably very extreme autocratic symbol, but those similar themes are interpenetrate or go through 20th century after Hitler to the present, correct?
Well, exactly. Now, there are, of course, differences between Hitler and autocrats today, very important ones. When I talk about Hitler pioneering popular autocracies, I'm talking about the attention he paid to optics, of course, the importance to him of popular support, and his role as the image of what the country was. Of course, one major difference is that Hitler didn't allow other parties, unlike Erdogan in Turkey or Orban in Hungary. He did, however, have these plebiscites, which were carefully orchestrated, like so many other things. In the wake of some of Hitler's achievements, like the remilitarization of the Rhineland, there would be a big propaganda push, and then 3 weeks later, and a question, yes or no, do you approve of Hitler? So he was very interested in popular opinion, but did not allow parties and the vote. One of the differences that happened throughout the 20th century is how widespread the belief in democracy and the hope of widespread democratic governments became, so that autocrats today pay more attention to that, at least initially. In fact, as opposed to a traditional model for explaining the rise of autocracy, that is a coup d'etat, the old model, take over by force of arms, today leaders at various stages of advancing their dictatorship or autocracy have come to power through democratic institutions. And that's a way that Hitler also illustrated and led the way there, pioneering how you come to power not through a coup d'etat, but through the institutions of the Constitution. But as soon as you get there, these men like Hitler crippled democratic institutions they used to come to power, the guardrails of democracy, especially media, the judiciary. So they take mass opinion into account. That's certainly the reason that Hitler wanted to come to power by a mass movement rather than a coup d'etat, is that he wanted real authority. He wanted to convince the people that, in fact, to show the people that they had really made the right decision with him.
Right. So he actually went through the putsch, 1924, jail, Landsberg prison, and then comes out and says, I'm now a man of the law, and I'm going to go through all this positive. But like you said, so he gets into power, starts making shifts. I mean, that's similar to some of these other states today, kind of like China and Turkey, right, where they got into power and then they make sure that any alternate views are suppressed, right?
Right. And in fact, though, if you look at some of Hitler's earliest writings, starting in 1920, we know so little of him before 1919, 1920, he's already talking about a mass movement and a dictator. But the 1923 coup is always given credit for having changed his mind, although some say that he was talked into that coup attempt by the SA. In any case, he had something to fall back on when that failed. That is this idea of mass movement. Now, of course, Hitler also used political violence to any extent that he could that achieved his ends, and so do the dictators today. I think especially China has just illustrated how civil resistance can be absolutely crushed. And it's a tragedy, of course, that a civil resistance often doesn't have allies. In Myanmar, U.S. companies benefiting or profiting from the dictatorship ally with the oppressive tyrants rather than with the poor civilians trying to protest. So many people will look at civilian protest and say, it doesn't work, let's forget about it, it's all or nothing. But they don't expect the same from other tactics that are also always proximate and never always going to win. Now, these dictators realize an old axiom that is attributed to Bismarck, that is a hero of Hitler's, where he says something like, you can do anything with a bayonet but sit on it. And you can cut down oppositional forces, and you must do that. You arrest the voices of defiance, lock them up. For example, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega, that's in the news a lot these days, just won re-election after jailing 7 rival candidates and dozens of members of the opposition. So it's not as if these new dictators don't use force. Ortega is so well established, no one really thinks that this election was a real election. But to the extent they can, these popular dictators prefer to master the optics and the images so that they attract the great masses. In other words, the people who they need to fulfill their mission, they want to satisfy through manipulating the media or packing the judiciary. Now, that brings up another major difference with Hitler. Of course, there's the genocide, there's the anti Semitism, but that is part of Hitler's outsized, breathtaking ambition to have his country take charge of the continent itself and to change history for 1,000 years. That's a main reason why Hitler is so different from some of the dictators today. I think you could look at Franco or Mussolini. Mussolini would have been in power much longer as a popular dictator had he not been forced into going to war much earlier than he wanted to by Hitler. So fascism in Italy and Germany did pioneer mass-backed autocracy, but I think there are certain pressures in our century that have accelerated this danger that we need to think about. I like to refer to them as strong men. We haven't had many women who are kind of nutty enough to go out in the middle of a crisis and tell people that they are going to solve it all on their own. Just believe in me, back me, and I'll solve all of your problems.
Right, but you still have this. I mean, I think one of the interesting things in your book is that authoritarianism has been steadily increasing, this kind of top-down thing, thus bringing in this kind of populism. It was interesting too. You also mentioned the Peronism in Argentina. He learned from Hitler and Mussolini, and that's probably an interesting study in authoritarianism and how populism operates within that, and trying to maintain. I mean, it was kind of a notoriously corrupt political system, right? Or Peronism.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does indicate populism. There are different definitions of populism. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear. The common definition is anti-elitism. A more general, broader definition is anti-otherism. That is, you define yourself as the nation, as the real people, and this is often done racially or ethnically. And the problem is that others are coming in and taking a zero sum number of jobs or resources. So that's used a lot by these populists to galvanize support, to create a sense of identity by it's a negative integration. You know who you are because you're not this part of the population that's trying to come in and take what's not theirs. I think also today, since Peronism in this century, we have a sense of crisis and social unrest that might actually elevate the sense of attraction of a strong man. It brings a sense of urgency and a search for quick solutions. That was certainly the case with Hitler and the Great Depression, where as soon as that Great Depression hit, Hitler went from like 2.7% in the national polls to the second strongest party a year later in 1930, and then to 37% in 1932. So that this sense of urgency, a sense that, why not take a risk for on the basis of some promise, some person who seems to have credibility and promises that he can fix everything. Uh, the point there is that belief plays a much bigger role than does reason. And in conditions of the pandemic that we have today, poverty and inequality is growing. In the background, global warming and other existential threats. All of this can create a sense of crisis and a sense that things are out of control, and a kind of matrix for belief in somebody like Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Putin in Russia, that we need our guy, we need a strong man. We can't do it ourselves, of course, but why don't we give this strong man control to make decisions for us?
Right, and that's like a perfect example of Putin, right? He comes in after, Glasnost and some of these other characters, and really comes in as a promise, but he turned the screws on authoritarianism. If he's not an outright autocrat himself, I think he changed a lot. I mean, you could see him right in that model of the authoritarian. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Oh, yes, definitely. And the fact is that Putin, Erdogan, and Orban, these are competent people who know all of this and have learned from each other. There's a sense that if you just teach about autocracy, if you teach about genocide, and we have to try, we have to do that in the hopes that it will stem all of those. But there are plenty of people who are eager to learn how to be the tyrant, and the desire for power is so strong. Some people suffer from it more than others. So. It is a temptation, but it never happens without some symbiotic relationship to certain people. Of course, there is a group of what you could see as aristocrats in an autocracy that is benefiting, has power as well from an autocracy, and wouldn't have it in a democracy. But there are some people who actually are quite happy trading off a sense of security for freedom. Sure, take away the freedom, it makes life less complicated. Some people don't want anything more, apparently, than to just have a private life where they can just to go through their private sphere as reduced as it is. Certainly, uh, autocrats can sometimes allow freedoms. Just don't put your nose in politics.
Right. So you see that like autocracy, and you have these populist movements. I mean, we talk about the Arab Spring, things that happened in Egypt, even in the United States. There's been a recent upsurge in kind of populism. Can you talk about how that the impulse of the kind of the masses, whether it's spontaneous or organized, have changed power dynamics geopolitically in certain countries?
Well, there was a lot of hope in what we call people power, of course, surging after the collapse of communism. And maybe it was as strong as ever during the Arab Spring. And tragically, uh, what happened is that many people in society, of course, if you take East Germany, for example, and the uprising there, you had maybe 800,000 people total on the streets demanding something different. Many of them wanted to reform communism, not become part of the West, so that people just don't act collectively. They have many different reasons for acting in different directions. There's a metaphor I heard recently of society as all these different chorales, and all of them singing a different tune, or some of them looking for a strong man. It's as I said, something that gains attraction in the context of crisis, and it doesn't ask for hard reasoning. I think it offers the exercise of belief as opposed to enlightenment thinking. I think people are quite capable of reason uh, and making choice. Democracy depends on well-informed voters, but these autocrats use emotions, deeper emotions, psychological uh, tricks and optics, so that it's an easier solution. Of course, many people have so many problems on their hands anyway. They certainly cannot take the energy and time to join protests on the street or even vote. So they many people hope to be free of politics and concern about national politics, just through so they can go about their own their own lives.
Right. I mean, and you said, I think you wrote that it was assumed that some of these post-communist bloc countries would just move towards liberal democracy, and that didn't really happen in every case. So I think that assumption wasn't fit. Can you talk about kind of like the advent of media, social media, and advertising in this kind of new dynamic between populism and authoritarianism?
Oh, that's a good point. I'm glad you bring up social media and the internet. I think it's changed the way that propaganda works, perhaps. Certainly under Hitler and through to to point of television, Hitler controlled what people heard and read just by controlling radio and the national borders. But with internet, there are still, of course, many efforts to control that. But if you can control the internet, one tactic is simply to let thousands of opinions loose, and then people feel like they're incompetent to really actually make their own choices, to filter out what's wrong and what's not. And so why not just believe in something that's most comforting? Uh, Certainly, um, the rise of advertising happened quite a bit earlier. I think the first book on advertising was written something like 1913. It's a craft that really went hand in hand with propaganda. There are similarities. Uh, that advertising can also promise quick fixes. You have a sense of urgency. Just use this product, everything will change. Of course, the basics of a short, sharp slogan repeated often, the notion that if you get children to buy your brand, they'll be loyal for life. Uh, and uh, so that the idea and the values of democracy, that is, of well educated citizens who know what they're doing, that's not especially prized at all by autocrats who simply want support and find it much easier to uh, not to go into policy details at all, but just to use a broad brushstroke to try to sweep up as many people as possible, uh, be in their train. Certainly, the principle of advertising and propaganda together with brute force is what autocrats have used today. Looking at those we've already mentioned, they, as I said, they tend to grab control of the media as soon as they can, and then start to portray their opposition as enemies of the people, as threats, as existential threats, that's many people will be swept along with that, and of course, maintaining the judiciary is important as maintaining elections and political parties, just because it maintains the appearance of popular support.
Right. So that's really it. It's like the trick is that the autocrats use all of the former institutions and just change them a little bit, but keep them out as kind of a facade, a window dressing on their autocracy. Would you agree with that?
Yes, exactly. It's I think it is an outgrowth of the uh, tremendous sort of valuation on democracy that took place in the 20th century. And of course, that has been growing for several centuries in Europe and in North America. The idea that people need to make their own decisions about their government. Uh, but these autocrats degrade the institutions while keeping up the appearance of them. They're not concerned at all with the spirit of the law, uh, but with the letter or with the facade of the law. An important point has been made recently about the importance of norms. Uh, that that a constitution simply will never be enough on its own to protect a population, because majorities or minorities, actually, a lot of these, like Hitler, autocrats can take power through minority, a substantial minority, 35, 40%, and build on that once they get control. People giving them a chance or going along, making their life easier, their popularity will grow. They have ways of doing that, but it's it's something that we see rising in around the globe today. The effort to maintain the appearance and the effort to maintain popular support as much as possible. Orban in Hungary has called this illiberal democracy.
And you're right. And you can kind of see that in Canada, especially with COVID happening. authoritarianism in U.S., Canada, UK, France. There's all kinds of public protests. So it's really, this book is very timely considering kind of these populist responses to this new authoritarianism in regards to COVID. So really came out at the right time. And you find that you talk about how both authoritarianism and liberal democracy are driven by the people. So it's really whether the people get pacified or activated to make those changes in their government. Would you agree with that?
I do, and it's just asking more than many people are willing to do. In addition to everything else in their life, the sense of crisis, making ends meet, providing for their family, to collect on the streets and endure whatever social opprobrium or police threats, so that the protesters in Hong Kong were amazing. I think one of the problems of protest that the East Germans, for example, illustrated how to do that so well, that none of them provoked the police into using violence. Often, these strictly disciplined protests can be thrown off when you have an agent provocateur come in and start using violence. The first rocks thrown or guns fired will certainly result in the use by the police of their much greater uh, resources for doing violence. So this thing about collective popular action is very fragile, and yet the principle remains that if you have enough people who agree to non-comply with the dictator, that a dictator will lose power and will eventually perhaps fall from power. There's another German example of that in 1923, the attempted the coup, the cop putsch. That was actually 1920, when a military uprising had nowhere to go because the government, the socialist government, called a general strike, and no one was there to do the bidding of this military leader, and he fled for his life to Scandinavia. So the principle certainly holds. It's just that there are many different reasons for people to act in many different ways, and often to support autocrats rather than democracy. Now, autocrats using violence are sometimes supported because of their political violence. If you think that the autocrat is going to use violence against your enemy and finally correct the score on your behalf, that's a great motivation. The display of force has its own psychological advantage, but certainly Hitler, when he went in after the communists in 1933, as soon as he was named chancellor, he had a great deal of support because of the depth of animosity and fear of communism that the majority had. So it's also a question here we started to think of that comes out in this book of pillarization. That is, society is pillarized into all kinds of various groupings, and there are various psychological mechanisms here. For example, there's a recent book, Light That Failed, that talks about how in Eastern Europe, the sense in the West that they had everything figured out and all that the Eastern European countries had to do was follow the Western model was resented. And certainly that also, we can see that in the unification in Germany since the collapse of communism. we see that in the East, there's been a reluctance to admit that they were like second-class citizens all along, and that they hadn't learned anything. They don't have anything to contribute. There's various ways in which democracy has trouble advancing, because it also depends on bureaucracies, of course. I wonder why I lost you there. I can't hear you. Oh.
Sorry, I'm talking to myself. Sorry, I turned my mic off because there was some noise in the background. So a lot of things are happening in the world. There's this kind of populism up against a lot more authoritarianism, it seems, globally. What else would you like to add, or anything I missed before we wrap up this discussion?
I don't know whether I have anything else to say. I've enjoyed the conversation. Just to emphasize that it seems that the dictatorships are learning from each other how to be effective in appearing to be popular. And it's not only that the people themselves are not only in favor of democracy for various reasons. So thank you for the interview.
Awesome. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. Again, the professor's name is Nathan Stoltzfus. Title of the book is The Power of Populism and People, Resistance and Protest in the Modern World. And where's the optimal place to get the book? Is it Amazon, or do you have another site?
Yes, I think Amazon is good. It's from Bloomsbury Books, but most people know how to get to Amazon quickly. My own page is on Florida State University, fsu.edu/Nathan-Stoltzfus.
Okay, I'll put that in the show notes too. I'll put your contact information there as well. And thanks so much for your time, Professor. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you.
Cool. Stay there for a second.